Welcome to another edition of the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. I'm Don Grodoff. Along with my wife Gina, we have a practice called Focused Healthy Family, helping families get past the behavior and anxiety issues naturally. We also produce the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast, where we are advocates for our own family and others dealing with OCD and anxiety. In the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast, we do interviews, provide resources, and information for treatment and support of OCD recovery. We also want to hear from you, your comments, and if you want to tell your story, we want to put it up on the podcast, on our Stories from the OCD side. Our goal in these podcasts is to raise awareness of and advocate for the recovery from obsessive-compulsive disorder, better known as OCD. Sponsoring our podcast is Quintessential Biosciences, better known as Q Sciences. Gina and I learned the hard way when we realized our daughter's supplements weren't being absorbed properly, and she really wasn't getting the nutrients that she needed. We knew the power of quality supplements in our health of our family, so it was time to find a better product. That is when we were introduced to Q Sciences. Q Sciences products provide the highest quality, maximum absorption possible, and improved health for the body and mind. Products like hemp oil, sleep spray, and Kids Focus convinced us that they really make a difference in our family's health. You too can have a healthy family, so stop wasting your money on supplements that don't work. Check out Q Science products today at qscience.focusedhealthyfamily.com. That's the letter Q, sciences.focusedhealthyfamily.com. You can also find the link on the invisiblewheelchair.com front page. Now, let's get to that podcast. Today is another interview podcast here on the Invisible Wheelchair. Another professional talking about OCD or an anxiety issue. Let's join that interview now. Today I have the great privilege of introducing you to Dr. Zurita Ona, known to many as Dr. Z. Dr. Z is a licensed clinical psychologist in California. Her clinical work started first as a school psychologist and then as a clinical psychologist. She has significant experience working with children, adolescents, and adults in OCD, trauma, anxiety, and emotional regulation problems. Dr. Z is the founder of the East Baybehaviortherapycenter, a boutique therapy practice where she runs an intense outpatient program integrating acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, and exposure response prevention, ERP, to support clients getting stuck from obsessions, figuring out what they care about, and do stuff that matters to them. Dr. Z attends local, national, and international conferences on a regular basis in order to keep up with current clinical research and deliver up-to-date therapy services to her clients. In addition to her doctoral training, Dr. Z has been nominated as a Fellow of the Association of Contextual Behavioral Science. She's a graduate of the International OCD Foundation's Behavior Therapy Training Institute, BTTI, for the treatment of pediatric OCD and adult OCD. Her clinical work is primarily based on exposure and response prevention, the recognized frontline treatment for OCD, anxiety, and related condition disorders. Dr. Z is intensely trained in dialectical behavior therapy, DBT. Over the last 10 years, Dr. Z has been learning, practicing, and teaching acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT. Dr. Z is a behavioral therapist with a passion for evidence-based practices including cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. Her clinical work is dedicated to helping all her clients get unstuck and live the life they want to live. Now, let's go to that interview. Well, Dr. Z, welcome back to the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. It is so good to have you back. It's been quite a while since we've talked, and I'm so glad you're here. So thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me again. And certainly so much has happened since the last time we spoke.
So we got some things to talk about.
A lot to catch up.
Yes. So today we're going to go around the idea of how we relate to our mind differently to be able to maximize exposure, which is the part of ERP. So that's what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to kind of open it up to you to tell us a little bit about what that really means.
Yeah. Thank you so much for starting there. As you know, I practice acceptance and commitment therapy, and I do the blend of ACT with exposure response prevention, which is the frontline treatment for OCD and anxiety. But also in my work as a clinician, I'm sure you have seen this, is that one size treatment, one size of exposure doesn't fit all. Even though we know that exposure works and we have a lot of research showing how effective it is, we also have many times in which people get stuck facing their fears, facing their worries, facing their anxieties. It's not this linear process, and exposure, it's not this clean and magical thing that
no, not at all.
Actually can get very messy, right? And many times when you're helping a person to face their fears, or when we are facing our fears, we also encounter micro fears, or we encounter different types of obstacles, like I feel too much my anxiety, or I'm trying to power through with my exposures, or maybe I am using my exposure as a compulsion, or I am doing mental reassurance. I'm telling myself that everything is going to be okay, it's going to be fine. So in my work, I have encountered some of those obstacles many times with the children, with the teens, with the adults. And especially with adults, I will say, I have witnessed very close how even though they know what to do with exposures, they know how to approach their fears and the images and the obsessions, many times they have developed a belief systems about anxiety, a belief systems about fear. They have been exposed to many messages like, I shouldn't be afraid, I should be fearless. If I think a lot about something, means something about me. If I am having this repetitive thought, maybe there is a hidden intention I am having. So within acceptance and commitment therapy, we call those thoughts ruling thoughts. The reason why they are called ruling thoughts is because they are not flexible thoughts. They're actually very rigid. They have been reinforced. They have been overgeneralized to many situations. And what I have found is that there may be 9 or 11 ruling thoughts that I see my clients sometimes getting stuck with, that doesn't help them to approach exposure with openness and with curiosity. So if I step back and I think in the case of chronic worry or generalized anxiety disorder, or in the case of obsessive compulsive disorder with OCD, you may hear things like, if I don't do anything about this obsession, it's the same as causing it. So an example will be, if I am afraid of harming my partner, that's the obsession. What if I stab my partner? There is that belief that I have to do a compulsion. I have to avoid hanging out with my partner. I have to avoid being in the kitchen with their knives if my partner is around. Because if I don't do that, it's the same as wanting to stab my partner. So the ruling thought here again is, if I don't do anything about this obsession, it's the same as causing it. And that's a belief that many times keeps driving a lot of the compulsions. Or you will hear the other things, the other thought that I hear a lot from my clients is if I am having this thought a lot about what if I am living in a ultra reality? What if this is not real? If I'm having a lot that thought, maybe it's possible. Maybe it really means that this is not real, that this is a fantasy world. So what you have, if you step back, the ruling thought is because I think so, because I think a lot about it, it means it's real. So those are examples of how the ruling thoughts can make it really, really hard for a person to face their fears, because they have this large belief system about what it means to be afraid, about the importance of thinking. And what happens is that they hold with white knuckles onto these thoughts, and they're taking every single thought as the absolute truth. So if you try to do exposure maybe too quickly when people have these belief systems, it will be hard for them to approach exposures with curiosity, because they're still holding again with white knuckles onto those beliefs. So they are very scared about not doing a compulsion. They are very scared of not doing an avoidant behavior. So those, I think, are obstacles that may show up in the exposure. And that's what I think that in my work, I have seen that if you teach clients, if you help clients to develop a more flexible, lighter relationship with their mind in preparation for exposure work, you may actually maximize the effects of exposure. Okay. Because there is a big difference if I know that my mind doesn't tell me the truth all the time. If I know that not every single thought that I have equals the truth when I'm approaching exposures, right? If I know that my mind is just a content generating machine and a pattern generating machine that is coming all the time, all types of content, then I am going to be in a very different place to face my fears, because I know that my mind doesn't have the truth all the time. But if I don't know that, it's actually super scary to do exposures, right? It may get on my way because I'm still, holding my mind with us as if my mind has the truth.
So, you said there were like 9 or 11 pretty much common ones you hear all the time. Can you talk about some of those? Like you've given us a couple of examples, maybe just give a few more of what those ruling thoughts, those cemented thoughts in our mind, it would be kind of like mindset, wouldn't it? Is that, kind of the same principle in a way of a mindset, but it's not a good mindset. And
I like what you're saying. It's certainly creating a different mindset before approaching exposure, right? So the things that I hear a lot, the ruling thoughts that I hear a lot is, I have to respond to thinking with more thinking, right? A lot about something, I have to keep thinking about this, right? So that's a classic one. And that's how people, again, with OCD, they may go into having an obsession, one obsession on the house, and then a bunch of mental compulsions, right? Because they believe that the only way to handle thinking is with more thinking. Another one will be that every single thought equals the truth. If I am thinking about this, means this is real. If I am afraid of harming someone on the freeway, it means that that's going to be the case, right? That's a thought action fusion, right? I can make this happen, right? Yeah. Another one. The other one is that I shouldn't have weird content. No one in the world has weird content in their mind. And sometimes when you think about obsessions, there are obsessions that are maybe, this is not the right word because all obsessions can be extremely distressing, but there are some obsessions that are more related to a person's life. Am I a good mother? Do I love my partner, right? But there are other times in which people are walking in the streets and they may see body parts of mutilated bodies, or they may see blood, right? Or they may see weird things, right? Sexual images. So when they have those images, right, another ruling thought is, I shouldn't have that. No one in the world has those weird thoughts. when in fact we all have sometimes weird thoughts. It just happens that we don't get hooked on them, right? So that's another ruling thought. I shouldn't have these weird thoughts. The other one that comes a lot is, and this is a very, I think, popular one again, because if I think about something a lot, it may mean something. So if I have, going back to the example of having aggressive obsessions, if I am afraid of stabbing you, right? And I have an obsession and I have images coming about me stabbing you, somehow, right, I may think that that's a hidden intention I have. It's a representation of my character. So that's another rule. If I think a lot about something, maybe that's reflecting a hidden intention I do have. So those are, I think, there are many other ones.
Yeah.
Worry also, right? The only way to handle a worry is just to be prepared for what could possibly go wrong, right? I think problem solving a little bit. So, but ruling thoughts, again, it's a belief systems, in particular about worries, fears, anxieties, that they have been reinforced. And they do get in the way of practicing exposures.
So I would think that though you would start working on that really first before you even get to the exposures, or are you doing both at the same time? How do you resolve that mindset?
That's a great question. You see, I think my work over the years has been evolving and shifting. I know in the last manuscript I published, right, I lay out in detail how I do it. But a short response is, when a client comes for therapy, we do this very comprehensive intaking. We're administering some measurements. We're trying to map how OCD shows up in a person's life in detail, what are the obsessions, what are the compulsions, what are the avoidant behaviors. We clarify what matters to them, why in the world they are going to be doing these exposures, what is that in the service of. We do various clarifications up front. And then we talk about these ruling thoughts. I share with them that our mind is more like a content generating machine and a pattern making machine. It's all the time coming up with content, and it's creating patterns of thinking, patterns of behaving, patterns of making sense of what's happening in our body. And what happens is that even though our mind is an incredible device, it's also an overly protective friend that it needs to come at, with reasons why we have to, make sure with that and check for threats, right? And it's actually harder if your brain is also predisposed biologically to scan for threat. So I talk about that, and we do a couple of experiential exercises to notice how, without doing anything, our mind will always be on. It's always on and on, like blah, 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 yap, right? And then what we do, we actually practice how to catch each one of these ruling thoughts. And my clients are tracking how in their day-to-day life, they're actually getting hooked on these ruling thoughts. And the ruling thoughts, again, are more about thinking, right? How I am relating to thinking, how I am relating to all this weird content that may come up in my mind, how I get hooked on the idea that I can only respond to thinking with more thinking. So for a couple of days, they're actually catching what's happening with their mind. And every session we're doing like a micro tip, a micro skill to acknowledge that I have this push to hold into that thought. What happens if I do so? And then we develop a values-based exposure menu. So, sorry, this was a very long response.
No, that's fine. It's really good. We need this explanation because we talked about this before. One of the problems I see in what most people do with the exposure, the ERP, is we really concentrate on the compulsion, getting rid, not doing the compulsion, getting rid of the compulsion. And I don't think we really think enough about or do enough about what about the thought? What about what the mind is doing? And we know we're supposed to, okay, it's, that we kind of accept the thought, which is what acceptance therapy is. But at the same time, I think more now people are fighting the thought versus trying to deal with it like you're talking about.
Yeah. No, I think you're right that if we think about exposure response prevention, it's certainly primarily focused on helping a person to face their fears. And we do a lot of the RP, the response prevention, right? Mm-hmm. Reduce compulsions, private and public compulsions, like mental compulsions, and reduce the avoidance. I also think, in my humble opinion, that when I think about ACT and ERP together, I think it's more about helping a person to develop a new relationship with their thinking and their fears and their worries as a life skill, not as a one-time thing they are going to be doing in therapy. I do not think as exposure as the goal of therapy. I think of exposure as the means to have a values-based life, to have a rich and fulfilling life. And I think that certainly for some people, they will be fine just doing exposure. But I know many times for my clients, they have this very rigid belief system they have developed about worries, fear, anxieties, and that gets in their way. That really gets in their way. Exposures, sometimes we think that exposure is also this mechanical thing, that we know how to do it, but it's very individualized. It's a very idiographic struggle that the person has. No obsession may look the same for everyone, right?
Yeah.
Right?
So, yeah.
The way in which we hold with white knuckles into our thought is also so unique for every single person. So I think many clients will definitely benefit from learning to relate to their mind lightly and more functionally before doing any exposure work.
Well, and now what I'm sensing here, what I'm almost kind of hearing here, is that you're really kind of even treading into the mindfulness place. Because it's really, when I talk about one of the practices where I do my work, they call me the mindfulness coach. Because what I talk about is that we're really starting to tune back into ourselves, And I think what I'm sensing from this and what I kind of hear out of this is that's kind of what you're trying to do, is get them to really tune back into themselves, to get a different relationship with their mind, so that not only for the exposure part, but for their life itself, to be more conscious in their life, to be more tuned into what's going on, how they function and all that. Is that too far off base?
No, actually, it's very relatable, Dawn, and thank you for just making that link, right? I think certainly we know that mindfulness-based exposure, or the addition of mindfulness for people doing exposure, has been beneficial. And we know there are hundreds of positive results from practicing mindfulness, right? Yeah. I think the way that I think of mindfulness, maybe not to mindfulness, because I'm certainly not a mindfulness expert, but if I think more as an ACT therapist, what I do know is that it is very important for my clients to learn to step back and zoom out a little bit from whatever noise is going on the outside or on the inside in their head. And to me, that capacity to step back and watch and check what's happening increases our capacity to choose our behavior. So I think that can definitely augment by practicing formally mindfulness, right? I think what I try to teach my clients is like this maybe more precise skill, that when my mind keeps going on and on and on, I can say, here is my mind going in full motion. Here is my mind, just trying to protect me right now, right? Mm-hmm. Which requires certainly that you are aware of what's happening, right? You cannot change your behavior without stepping back and being in touch with what you're struggling with, what your mind is doing. And that's what I also think, that acceptance and commitment therapy by nature is an exposure treatment. The whole model is about getting in touch with whatever struggle, psychological, internal struggle you're having.
That is great. Well, I wanted to make sure that we talk a little bit about, because you have a new book out,
Thank you.
and I think I'd like to talk about what the name of the book, which I will put up on so for my audience, this book the information will be up on the invisiblewheelchair.com site. But tell us the name of it, and then tell us a little bit about what it is, if you would.
Yeah, no, and thank you so much for creating this space to share my work. The title of the book is a little bit on the long side.
Yeah, I know, because I wasn't going to write it down. It was too much.
Too long. So the title of the book is Living Beyond OCD, Using Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, a workbook for adults.
Okay, there you got it out now. I'm not going to print it across this. Well, we're not going to show this in video anyway, so I'm not going to print it across the screen.
So the process of writing the book was certainly one of the most exciting things I have done the last 2-3 years. I would say it's really coming from all the years of thinking how to make ACT and ERP more accessible for every client I work with. I feel extremely grateful for all the feedback I received from my clients and some of my colleagues that witnessed my process of writing it and how many times I got stuck and I have to go back and pilot things, right? But I have to say that one of the most one of the feedback that one of the most common feedback or messages I have been receiving the last couple of months is that it's a very comprehensive book for OCD, for any person that wants to prepare themselves for treatment, want to augment the treatment, or want to maintain their recovery, and that it shows hands-on how you can blend ACT and ERP. So to me, that was mission accomplished. I think many times it's hard to write things that people can relate to or they're accessible and make sense. So I spend a lot of time on that, trying to write something that is jargon-free, that it doesn't have hundreds of academic terms, and that has a lot of exercises for people to practice one skill, put it into action, and make the skill theirs. And then the book is organized in 10 sections. It's a little bit, I think it's really, comprehensive. It starts with the basics of what OCD is. I cover the different types of OCD, including metaphysical OCD, existential OCD, pure OCD, perfectionist OCD. For every type of OCD, I describe examples of how it looks and a description of what it is, right? How it looks in terms of obsessions, compulsions, and avoidance. I also have a very nice section on mental compulsions, because many times mental compulsions go unchecked. I describe mental compulsions from the simple forms, from repeating numbers, counting letters, to more complex forms like figuring things out, replaying past scenarios with what if, right? Or anticipating future scenarios with what if possibilities. And then I move people into look at a trilogy that makes their life miserable. What are they avoiding in their life? What are the compulsions they are doing? And what are these ruling thoughts they are getting hooked on? And then for every single, when we are addressing each one of the ruling thoughts, they have a micro tip, a mini exercise that they can do every single week. And then I talk about 3 particular shift moves. The whole book is about how to make a shift from a reactive move driven by compulsions and avoidance to a wise moves. So the shift moves is all really about embracing acceptance, watching our mind, and learning to ride the wave of overwhelming emotions like anxiety, fears, and worries, because they feel very yucky, right? And then clients, the readers, they go into discovering their values, and then they start practicing upfront acceptance and relating to their mind differently, more diffusion, and then sitting with uncomfortable emotions. So as they are doing that, they develop their values-based exposure menu, and then they start facing exposures with the classic exposures that we do: inter-offsetted exposure, imaginal exposure, situational exposure. I certainly have a bias towards situational exposure, just because that's my style, right? I am interested in helping people to know to check with themselves. When I have this thought or this image, what's the thing that I'm not doing, or am I doing a lot in my life? So I tend to do more situational exposure. Certainly, you still use imaginal exposures when needed. And then in the last part of the book, the last section, I talk about the most common blocks that I encounter on my work when clients are still using exposures as a form of compulsion, when clients are powering through the exposures. When clients, I am hooked on the idea that if they don't do anything about an obsession, means that they are immoral people, or that they are letting themselves off the hook. And I also have a section on how many times, especially with aggressive obsessions, sexual obsessions, harming obsessions, people are struggling being kind with themselves. And they think that by practicing self-compassion or kindness with themselves, they are giving themselves a permit to potentially doing bad things in the future. So I think I tried to map the most common blocks, and then I have some exercises for people to tackle each one of those blocks. For people listening, if they are interested in the book, my biggest advice is don't rush through the book. Make the skills yours. Give yourself the time to practice. It's a natural thing that when we are struggling, we want to have a quick fix. We want to solve things right away.
Yeah.
But especially with ACT and ERP, what is more important is that you read one chapter, sit with the skills at least for 1 week before going to the next one, and really create a space to practice experientially see how the skills work for you. In fact, before people move into exposures, I ask them to stop reading the book. I say, take a break for 2 weeks and practice more relating to your mind differently before facing exposures. Because even though it feels natural to trying to tackle OCD, I think the powering through doesn't help a person to develop a more flexible response with their fears. So that would be the biggest message for people listening who are interested in the book.
Well, it almost sounds like a program instead of a book, because it sounds very comprehensive, and I think that's wonderful. So that sounds like a great book. And like I said, I'll have it up for the audience to find a link to it. And well, Dr. Z, I'll tell you what, this has been another wonderful podcast here with a lot of good information. And one last thing I'll ask you to do is how best can my audience get a hold of you and find out more about you and your practice?
Yeah, thank you so much again for having me. It's always a treat to talk to you, Dawn. I appreciate what you're doing a lot. If people are interested, I have a website. It's www.thisisdrz.com. So it's pretty straight. Thisisdrz.com. And for also, I am hanging out a lot in Twitter. It's my favorite social media channel because it's brief, right? It's 140 characters. So I find that interesting. And for people that are interested, I do have an upcoming online class that is called ACT Beyond OCD, in which I am going to be walking people through every single one of these skills so they can tackle OCD and just get back into their lives.
Well, that sounds wonderful. Again, for my audience, I will also have the links up there that you just mentioned. And again, thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you so much, Dawn, and I hope we can do this again soon.
This concludes this podcast. We hope you will subscribe if you haven't already. Remember, we would love your comments, or if you have a story to tell, we want to put it up on the podcast. Simply go to invisiblewheelchair.com to do that. Don't forget to like us on Facebook at Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest, we love guests. So simply go to invisiblewheelchair.com and contact us from there. Gina and I are here to help you or your family get to a better place naturally. Simply visit focusedhealthyfamily.com for more information. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Keep tapping and focusing forward for a better way.